In the heart of the city hospital, the corridors hummed with the constant pulse of medical machinery and whispered conversations rather than boisterous crowds. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors and sterile walls lined with framed certificates and inspirational quotes. Here, life and death intermingled daily in quiet urgency. In one of the winding corridors that connected a series of specialized wards, a mystery was about to unfold, one that would expose hidden truths buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and desperation. Dr. Edwin Carver, a well-respected mid-level administrator in the hospital's quality assurance department, was known for his meticulous attention to detail. For years he had scrutinized patient records, audited supply orders, and ensured that the hospital maintained its high standards. Late one evening, after the last of the elective surgeries had finished and the emergency department's chaotic rhythm had subsided, Dr. Carver had been reviewing discrepancies in several procurement reports. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed that minor shortages in essential medical supplies kept appearing in the records, small, almost imperceptible differences that when aggregated amounted to a sizable loss. Troubled by these findings, he began to compile his notes in a leather-bound journal, detailing every anomaly with unwavering precision. A few days later, during his routine rounds in the administrative wing, a call came in from a night nurse about a disturbance in one of the on-call rooms. Dr. Carver, distracted by his mounting concerns, hurried to the location. When he arrived at the dimly lit room, he found it empty, except for a single overturned chair and scattered papers. Later that night, his colleagues would learn that he had been seen arguing on the phone in hushed tones near the records room, his face etched with worry. No one could have foreseen that these were his final moments. The following morning, janitorial staff discovered his lifeless body in a quiet corner of the records archive. He was found slumped over a desk, his suit disheveled and stained with dark blotches of blood. His eyes, wide in an expression of silent horror, were fixed on the ceiling, and in his right hand he clutched a small scrap of paper. The paper's surface, damp and smeared with hurried ink, contained a cryptic sequence of numbers and letters that defied immediate interpretation. Shock and grief rippled through the hospital as news of his death spread, and the sterile environment of the administrative wing became a crime scene under the harsh scrutiny of forensic teams. Detective Marisol Grant was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator whose reputation for unconventional methods and relentless determination preceded her. Marisol arrived at the hospital under the buzzing hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet murmur of anxious staff. Rather than rushing to secure a narrative, she moved slowly along the corridor, her eyes absorbing every detail, the faint aroma of antiseptic mixed with an underlying note of fear, the distant beeps of monitors in the intensive care unit, and the solemn silence of a place that had just witnessed tragedy. In the records archive, a room lined with tall shelves burdened by file boxes and ancient logbooks, Marisol knelt beside Dr. Carver's body. With gloved fingers, she gently retrieved the scrap of paper from his grasp and examined it under the beam of her flashlight. The hurried scrawl of numbers and letters was barely legible, as though written in a moment of frantic urgency. Every detail, the way the paper curled at the edges, the precise location where his body had collapsed, even the pattern of faint footprints in the dust on the floor, was carefully noted in her notebook. Marisol knew that in a case like this, nothing was trivial. Even the smallest irregularity might be the key to exposing a conspiracy lurking behind the hospital's polished veneer. Instead of immediately constructing a linear timeline, Marisol allowed her investigation to branch out like the intertwined roots of an old tree. Her first step was to gather statements from those who had been present in the hospital that night. In a quiet corridor near the nurses' station, she met with Liana Ortiz, a night shift nurse with kind eyes and a steady voice. Liana recalled that earlier in the evening, she had seen Dr. Carver pacing near the pharmacy department. He looked unsettled, Liana said softly, her expression troubled. He kept glancing at his tablet and murmuring about figures that don't add up in the supply logs. I assumed he was just frustrated with the day's workload, but now I think he was on to something far more serious. Liana's recollections painted a picture of a man who had been increasingly consumed by an investigation that threatened to upend the established order. Next, Marisol interviewed Derek Nguyen, a security guard who patrolled the administrative wing. Derek remembered passing Dr. Carver in the early hours of the night, noticing that the administrator seemed preoccupied. He was checking his phone constantly and even stopped to review a few pages of a document at one of the desks. Derek said, his tone low and reflective. I asked if everything was okay, but he just gave me a tight smile and said he was handling some discrepancies. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm convinced he was onto something that someone didn't want known. Derek's words suggested that Dr. Carver's investigation might have disturbed powerful interests within the hospital's inner circle. Haunted by these accounts, Detective Grant obtained a warrant to search Dr. Carver's modest apartment, located in a quiet building just a few blocks from the hospital. The apartment was unassuming, a single room with minimal furnishings, a worn-out couch, a cluttered desk covered in scattered papers and old receipts, and a narrow window that looked out onto a busy street. The air was thick with the odor of stale coffee and aged paper, a quiet testament to a life devoted to precision and order. In a locked drawer of an old oak desk, Marisol discovered Dr. Carver's personal journal. Its pages were filled with meticulous entries that began with the routine details of his day, shift times, observations of supply deliveries, and notes on patient feedback. But as the days wore on, the entries grew increasingly anxious. In one entry, dated 3 days before his death, Dr. Carver wrote, "There are persistent discrepancies in our supply and donation records, small amounts missing from every transaction that, when aggregated, become alarmingly significant. I fear that someone with access to these records is diverting funds for their own gain. If I continue to probe, I risk exposing a secret that those in power would kill to keep hidden." The final line ended abruptly, as if his pen had been seized mid-sentence, leaving behind a void laden with unsaid warnings. At the same time, the cyber unit managed to recover fragments of deleted text messages from Dr. Carver's aging cell phone, a device battered by years of intensive use. The recovered messages were stark and terse. One message simply stated, "Stop now," while another declared, "Don't ask questions." Their cold, clipped tone was unmistakable, a warning that had been issued in a moment of desperate urgency, and one that had clearly been ignored. Rather than forcing the evidence into a neatly ordered timeline, Detective Grant allowed her investigation to expand organically. With permission from the hospital's board of directors, she turned her attention to the administrative records housed in the back office of the Quality Assurance Department. The room was cramped, filled with stacks of handwritten ledgers and digital archives displayed on aging monitors. Working alongside Marcus Reed, a veteran records clerk who had maintained these files for decades, Marisol painstakingly compared the digital logs with the original handwritten records. The differences were minuscule, a digit here, a date there, but when aggregated over a period of several months, they revealed a pattern that was far too consistent to be accidental. The digital records consistently showed that every shipment and donation was complete, whereas the handwritten logs documented recurring shortfalls, tiny amounts missing from each entry that, when totaled, amounted to a significant diversion of funds. Forensic accountants were brought in to analyze the financial data. Their rigorous investigation produced detailed charts and graphs that mapped the cumulative impact of these discrepancies. The data was damning. These small, seemingly negligible shortfalls, when taken in aggregate, had resulted in the misappropriation of a substantial sum, a sum that had been covertly transferred through a complex web of electronic transactions to an offshore account linked to a shell corporation. Every slight variation, every tiny inconsistency, contributed to a broader narrative of deliberate systematic fraud, a network of mid-level administrators who had exploited vulnerabilities in both digital and paper-based record-keeping systems for personal gain. As the layers of evidence accumulated, Detective Grant began receiving anonymous tips. A plain envelope, discovered tucked away in a filing cabinet in the back office, contained a typed note that read, "Every number conceals a truth." Another tip, delivered via a secure email from an untraceable source, instructed her bluntly, "Cease your investigation." Although these messages offered little detail, their tone was unmistakably menacing, a clear indication that those behind the scheme were monitoring her every move and were prepared to act if their secret was threatened. Federal agents, alerted to the potential breadth of the corruption, soon joined the investigation with their state-of-the-art digital forensic tools. They painstakingly reconstructed a near-complete timeline of the deleted text messages from Dr. Carver's phone. revealing that the warnings had grown increasingly urgent in the final days before his murder. Concurrently, forensic accountants developed intricate financial models that detailed how the aggregation of minor discrepancies over time resulted in the misappropriation of funds, a diversion that could only be explained by deliberate systematic fraud. The combined evidence formed an inescapable mosaic over the span of several years. A clandestine network had siphoned off resources from the hospital's operations, and when Dr. Carver's investigation threatened to expose them, his life was ruthlessly ended. Detective Grant compiled all her findings into an exhaustive report, a sprawling dossier of over 400 pages that interwove photographs of the crime scene in the silent, deserted corridors of the records archive, scans of pages from Dr. Carver's journal, digital reconstructions of the deleted text messages, and detailed financial analyses that traced the diverted funds to their offshore destination. The report presented a coherent narrative. Subtle discrepancies in the hospital's donation and supply records had been deliberately engineered for years to divert funds into an offshore account. Carver began to document these irregularities. His investigation threatened to expose a deep-rooted network of corruption, a network that, in a ruthless bid to protect its secret, ended his life. Deeply disturbed by the implications of the evidence for public trust and the integrity of the institution, the district attorney convened a grand jury in the county courthouse, a sleek, modern building renowned for its uncompromising pursuit of justice. Over a series of marathon sessions that stretched late into stormy nights, expert witnesses testified about the digital forensic methods that recovered the deleted messages, the statistical analyses that demonstrated the improbability of the discrepancies being mere errors, and the forensic accounting that traced the misappropriated funds to an offshore account linked to a shell corporation. Their combined testimonies were delivered with technical precision and unyielding determination. After extensive deliberation, the grand jury returned indictments on multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to homicide, charges that directly linked the systematic manipulation of records to the murder of Dr. Edwin Carver. The trial unfolded over several weeks in a crowded courtroom populated by hospital staff, local residents, legal experts, and an array of journalists eager for accountability. Federal prosecutors presented their case with relentless clarity, interweaving digital reconstructions of the recovered text messages with detailed financial charts that illustrated the cumulative impact of the discrepancies over time. A digital forensics expert took the stand and painstakingly explained how the recovered messages, each a curt command to stop now or don't ask questions, had been reassembled into a continuous timeline that escalated as the investigation deepened. Forensic accountants unveiled intricate graphs that demonstrated how minor discrepancies, when aggregated over time, diverted a significant sum of money from the hospital's operating budget. Witness after witness recounted how the integrity of the records had gradually eroded, a slow, insidious process that allowed corruption to take root in a system once held in the highest regard. When Detective Grant finally took the stand, her voice was measured yet imbued with personal sorrow. She recounted with painstaking detail the moment she discovered Dr. Carver's body in the deserted archive, describing the cold, unyielding tile beneath her feet, the faint imprint of his shoes in a thin layer of condensation, and the fragile scrap of paper that now served as a mute testament to his final moments. Her narrative wove together every fragment of evidence, from the altered digital logs and handwritten discrepancies to the recovered journal entries and stark text messages, forming an unassailable portrait of deliberate, systematic corruption. Each observation, delivered with deliberate care, left the courtroom in a reflective silence as the magnitude of the deception was laid bare. In the end, the grand jury's indictments resulted in the conviction of several mid-level administrators and technical operatives directly implicated in the fraudulent scheme. They received lengthy prison sentences, and their names were recorded in the public record as stark reminders of the consequences of abusing institutional trust. Yet many in the community felt that full justice remained elusive. The highest-ranking conspirators, the masterminds behind the diversion, managed to shield themselves through complex legal defenses, and their identities remained largely hidden in the final verdicts. This lingering uncertainty cast a long, bitter shadow, a reminder that even when significant corruption is exposed, some secrets persist in the hidden recesses of power. In the months that followed the trial, the hospital's leadership was compelled to embrace a new era of accountability. Under intense public scrutiny, and with independent auditors meticulously examining every transaction, the institution overhauled its digital record-keeping systems. New protocols were instituted that required real-time logging of every donation, every supply order, and every administrative decision, all supported by robust encryption measures and periodic public audits. Although these sweeping reforms could not reverse the tragic loss of Dr. Carver, they signified a steadfast commitment to transparency, a promise that no hidden discrepancy would again erode the public's trust. Local media outlets, driven by a fierce dedication to investigative journalism, produced a series of documentaries and in-depth articles that meticulously chronicled every facet of the case, from the grim discovery in the deserted archive to the painstaking digital reconstructions that unmasked a covert network of corruption. Community forums and town hall meetings soon emerged in local civic centers, where residents, scholars, and civic leaders engaged in spirited discussions about the ethical responsibilities of digital record-keeping and the imperative of preserving institutional integrity. The story of Dr. Edwin Carver, a man whose unwavering pursuit of truth cost him his life, evolved into a potent symbol of accountability, inspiring a renewed determination among community members to scrutinize every record and expose every hidden anomaly. For Detective Marisol Grant, every new case was approached with the hard-earned lessons of this investigation deeply ingrained in her memory. In the quiet hours before dawn, in her modest office illuminated by a single desk lamp and accompanied by the gentle hum of her computer, she frequently revisited the recovered pages of Dr. Carver's journal and studied the reconstructed text messages with painstaking care. Each minor detail, a slightly altered ledger entry, a curt directive from a deleted message, reinforced her belief that persistent inquiry is the only path to justice, and that every hidden inconsistency has the power to unveil vast networks of corruption if pursued relentlessly. As the hospital gradually resumed its daily rhythm, patients receiving care in bright, bustling wards, staff diligently managing every detail, and the steady pulse of life echoing through every corridor, the legacy of the investigation reshaped not only the institution's internal operations, but also the broader community's commitment to accountability. The reformed digital systems, once vulnerable to subtle manipulation, now stood as models of transparency, rigorously audited by independent experts and accessible to any concerned citizen. Public discussions about the ethical management of data and the preservation of institutional integrity became a recurring feature at local universities and civic centers, ensuring that the lessons learned from Dr. Carver's tragic fate would resonate for years to come. In the final analysis, the case at the city hospital was more than a recounting of a single murder or a series of minor discrepancies. It was an intricate exploration of modern corruption, a narrative woven from digital clues, painstaking financial analysis, and the unyielding determination of an investigator who refused to let even the smallest details slip by unnoticed. The sweeping reforms that followed, the heightened vigilance among staff, and the community's collective commitment to scrutinize every record became a lasting legacy, a reminder that every hidden secret, no matter how insignificant it may seem, has the potential to expose a vast network of deceit. And as the hospital's automatic doors opened each day to welcome a new wave of healing and hope, the memory of Dr. Edwin Carver endured, a silent, persistent call to examine every anomaly and to ensure that the pursuit of truth remains the bedrock of a just society. Under the buzzing neon of downtown, an independent record store, known simply as Vinyl Vibes, pulsed with a quiet intensity amid the late-night crowd. The shop's walls, adorned with vintage album covers and shelves laden with rare pressings, radiated a nostalgic warmth that drew in collectors and curious passers-by alike. Inside, the ambient glow of carefully arranged LED fixtures highlighted rows of meticulously curated vinyl, while the low murmur of soft jazz mixed with distant laughter created an atmosphere of shared reverie. On this particular night, however, the hum of music and whispered conversations would soon be shattered by a discovery that threatened to expose hidden secrets within these cherished walls. In a back room behind the display of classic rock compilations, employee Marcus Delgado was performing his final inventory check. Marcus, a soft-spoken enthusiast with a keen eye for detail, had spent many late evenings ensuring that every record was in its proper place and that every price tag was accurate. As he methodically scanned the dusty bins and checked the logbooks, his flashlight caught an unusual glint on the floor near a narrow doorway leading to the staff office. Approaching cautiously, he discovered a sight that made his heart falter. Lying face down on the scuffed linoleum was the body of the store's manager. The man, impeccably dressed in a tailored shirt and dark trousers, now disordered and stained with blood, lay in a position that suggested he had collapsed suddenly. His eyes, wide and frozen in an expression of abject terror, stared blankly at the ceiling above a stack of unsold rare records. Clutched tightly in his right hand was a small scrap of paper, its edges damp and the ink blurred into an indecipherable jumble. Marcus's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone and whispered, "There's something wrong in here," his voice barely audible above the low hum of the store's stereo. Moments later, the quiet sanctuary of Vinyl Vibes was invaded by the sound of approaching sirens and the measured footsteps of uniformed officers. Within minutes, forensic specialists in navy blue coveralls swept into the back office. Their cameras flashed as they documented every detail: the precise angle of the manager's body against the cold floor, the faint imprint of his shoes in a thin film of spilled liquid, and the fragile scrap of paper clutched in his lifeless hand. It was immediately apparent that nothing about the scene was accidental. Each element had been arranged with deliberate care, as if someone had intended both to obscure the truth and to leave behind a final cryptic message. Later that night, investigators identified the victim as Calvin Monroe, the store's mid-level manager who had been with Vinyl Vibes for nearly 8 years. Colleagues remembered Calvin as a dedicated professional with an encyclopedic knowledge of vinyl history, a man whose passion for rare records had earned him respect among collectors and store owners alike. His precise nature had kept the store's inventory in impeccable order, and his friendly smile was a familiar comfort to loyal customers. Now his untimely death, discovered in a quiet back office amidst crates of long-neglected LPs, sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of music aficionados. The scrap of paper he had clutched offered no immediate explanation, only a baffling jumble of numbers and letters that hinted at a secret he had been desperate to reveal. Detective Renee Patel was assigned to the case. Renee had built her reputation on an ability to piece together the subtlest of clues and to read between the lines of seemingly ordinary details. Arriving at Vinyl Vibes just as the store's neon sign sputtered in the early hours, she moved purposefully through the shop, noting every nuance: the careful arrangement of vintage posters, the orderly stacks of LPs, the barely perceptible hum of the air conditioning mingling with the low strains of jazz. Rather than immediately constructing a timeline, Renee allowed herself to absorb the ambiance and environment, for she believed that the setting itself often held hints about the unseen forces at work. In the back office, amid piles of inventory sheets and dusty boxes of records, Renee knelt beside Calvin's body. With gloved fingers, she carefully removed the scrap of paper from his hand. The paper, water, stained and torn at the edges, displayed a hasty sequence of alphanumeric characters that might have been a code, a final clue, or perhaps a desperate note intended to warn someone. Every detail, the way the paper curled at the edges, the distinct outline of a signature that was almost visible, the faint trail of droplets on the floor, was meticulously recorded in her worn leather notebook. Rather than diving immediately into a linear narrative of the night, Renee opted to let the investigation develop in layers, like assembling a mosaic of fragmented memories and physical evidence. Her first step was to gather statements from those who had been present in the store during the evening's final hours. At the counter near the front of the shop, she encountered Talia Reyes, a cashier with an unassuming demeanor, whose eyes betrayed a deep concern. Talia recalled that earlier in the evening, as the rush had begun to wane, she had seen Calvin speaking in hushed tones with a customer about a rare record that had just arrived. He looked anxious, almost as if he had discovered something was wrong. Talia said softly, wringing her hands. He mentioned something about numbers not matching up on the delivery invoice. I assumed it was just a mistake, but now I worry he was onto something much more serious. Talia's quiet recollection hinted that Calvin had been investigating discrepancies in the store's records, an inquiry that might have unearthed a secret someone was desperate to keep hidden. Next, Renee interviewed Jonas Grant, a longtime employee who handled the store's shipping and receiving. Jonas remembered that over the past week, Calvin had become increasingly fixated on the inventory logs, spending hours comparing the digital records with physical receipts. I noticed he was scribbling notes furiously, checking the serial numbers on some of the rarest records in our collection, Jonas recalled, his voice tinged with regret. He said something about missing copies and altered figures, small details, but he seemed convinced that someone was tampering with the numbers. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it looks like he was trying to expose something big. His testimony added urgency to the investigation, suggesting that Calvin's discoveries might have jeopardized powerful interests within the collector community. Haunted by these accounts, Detective Patel obtained a warrant to search Calvin Monroe's modest apartment, located in an aging building a few blocks from the record store. The apartment was unpretentious, a single room furnished with minimal decor, a worn-out couch, and a cluttered desk piled high with old receipts, catalog cards, and faded photographs of concerts long past. The atmosphere was thick with the aroma of stale coffee and aged paper, a quiet archive of a life devoted to the preservation of musical history. In a locked drawer of an antique desk, Rene discovered Calvin's personal journal, a battered leather-bound notebook with pages filled in neat, deliberate script. The early entries were entirely routine, detailed logs of his work schedule, observations about shipments, and simple notations on inventory levels. But as the pages advanced, his tone grew markedly troubled. In one entry written 3 days before his death, he confided, "I have uncovered subtle discrepancies in our shipment records, small amounts missing from each delivery that, when combined, are far from trivial. I suspect that someone with privileged access is deliberately diverting a portion of our valuable collection for personal gain. If I continue to pursue this, I fear that I may expose a secret that someone will kill to keep hidden." The final sentence ended abruptly, as if his pen had been snatched away mid-sentence, leaving an ominous gap that chilled Rene to the core. At the same time, the cyber unit managed to recover fragments of deleted text messages from Calvin's aging cell phone, a relic of a bygone era with a cracked screen and keys worn smooth by time. The recovered messages were sparse and direct. One simply said, "Stop now," while another cautioned, "Don't question further." Their blunt, unadorned tone left no room for ambiguity. These were explicit warnings from an unknown source, warnings that had clearly come too late. Instead of forcing the evidence into a neat chronological account, Detective Patel allowed her investigation to branch out organically, piecing together a mosaic of clues from various sources. With permission from the store's management, she turned her attention to the administrative records stored in the cramped back office of Vinyl Vibes. The space was small, filled with aging computers, stacks of handwritten ledgers, and a pervasive smell of ink and paper, a hidden repository of decades of transactions and inventory adjustments. Working alongside a seasoned records clerk named Elliot James, whose long career had endowed him with an almost instinctive familiarity with the numbers, Rene meticulously compared the digital logs with the original paper records. The differences were slight. A single digit changed here, a date shifted there, but when aggregated over several months, they revealed a pattern that was too consistent to be random. The digital logs invariably reported that every shipment was complete, while the handwritten records consistently documented minor shortfalls, small amounts missing from each entry that, when combined, amounted to a significant diversion of funds and rare records. Forensic accountants were called in to analyze the financial data. Their exhaustive analysis produced detailed charts and graphs that mapped the cumulative impact of these discrepancies. The figures were damning. These minor gaps, seemingly insignificant on a daily basis, had over time resulted in the misappropriation of a substantial sum, a sum that had been covertly funneled through a labyrinth of electronic transfers to an offshore account linked to a shell corporation. Every fractional variance contributed to a broader narrative of deliberate, systematic fraud, a network of mid-level administrators who had exploited vulnerabilities in both digital and paper-based record-keeping systems to enrich themselves at the expense of Vinyl Vibes' prized collection. As the layers of evidence began to accumulate, Detective Patel started receiving anonymous tips. A plain envelope was discovered tucked behind a filing cabinet in the back office. Inside, a typed note read, "Every figure conceals a secret." Another tip arrived via a secure email from an untraceable source. "Cease your investigation." Although these messages offered little detail, their tone was unmistakably menacing, a clear indication that those behind the cover-up were monitoring her every move and were prepared to take drastic measures to protect their secret. Federal agents, alerted by the mounting evidence and the potential scope of the corruption, soon joined the investigation. Their state-of-the-art digital forensic tools allowed them to reconstruct a near-complete timeline of the deleted text messages from Calvin's phone, revealing that the warnings had escalated sharply in the days leading up to his murder. Concurrently, forensic accountants developed intricate models that demonstrated how the incremental misappropriation of funds, each minor discrepancy, when aggregated over time, resulted in a significant diversion from the store's operating budget. The combined evidence formed an inescapable mosaic over the span of several years. A clandestine network had siphoned off resources from Vinyl Vibes, and when Calvin's investigation threatened to expose the truth, his life was abruptly taken. Detective Patel compiled all her findings into a comprehensive report, a sprawling dossier of over 400 pages that interwove photographs of the crime scene in the dim back office, scans of pages from Calvin's journal, digital reconstructions of the deleted text messages, and detailed financial analyses that traced the diverted funds to their offshore destination. The dossier presented a coherent narrative. Subtle discrepancies in the store's administrative records had been deliberately engineered over time to divert funds and rare inventory into an offshore account. When Calvin began to document these irregularities, his investigation threatened to expose a deep-rooted network of corruption, a network that, in a ruthless bid to preserve its secret, ended his life. The district attorney, deeply troubled by the implications of the evidence for public trust in the local music community, convened a grand jury in a modern courthouse known for its no-nonsense approach. Over a series of marathon sessions that extended into stormy nights, expert witnesses testified about the digital forensic methods that recovered the deleted text messages, the statistical analyses that demonstrated the improbability of the discrepancies being accidental, and the forensic accounting that traced the misappropriated funds to an offshore account linked to a shell corporation. Their combined testimonies were delivered with unwavering technical precision. After extensive deliberation, the grand jury returned indictments on multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to homicide, charges that directly linked the systematic manipulation of records to the murder of Calvin Monroe. The trial unfolded over several weeks in a bustling courtroom filled with store employees, local residents, legal experts, and a throng of journalists. Federal prosecutors presented their case with relentless clarity, interweaving digital reconstructions of the recovered text messages with detailed financial charts that illustrated how minor discrepancies, when aggregated over time, diverted a significant sum of money from the record store's budget. A digital forensics expert took the stand and painstakingly explained how each terse command, "Stop now, don't ask questions," had been reassembled into a continuous timeline that escalated in urgency as the investigation progressed. Forensic accountants unveiled intricate graphs demonstrating how the cumulative effect of seemingly trivial errors had resulted in a financial gap that could only be the product of deliberate fraud. Numerous witnesses recounted the gradual erosion of record integrity, a slow, nearly invisible process that allowed corruption to grow unchecked within a system once revered for its reliability. When Detective Patel finally testified, her voice was calm yet imbued with deep personal sorrow. She recounted, with precise detail, the moment she discovered Calvin's body in the cramped back office, a moment marked by the sound of her footsteps echoing on worn linoleum, the faint trace of a single footprint in a smear of spilled liquid, and the fragile scrap of paper that had served as Calvin's final desperate clue. Her narrative stitched together every fragment of evidence, from the altered digital logs and handwritten discrepancies to the recovered journal pages and stern text messages, forming an unassailable portrait of systematic corruption. Every observation was delivered deliberately, leaving the courtroom in a reflective hush as the full magnitude of the betrayal was laid bare. Ultimately, the grand jury's indictments led to the conviction of several mid-level administrators and technical operatives directly implicated in the fraudulent scheme. They were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and their names were entered in public records as stark reminders of the perils of abusing institutional trust. Still, many in the community felt that justice had been only partly served. The highest-ranking conspirators, the masterminds behind the diversion, managed to shield themselves through complex legal maneuvers, and their identities remained largely hidden in the final verdicts. That lingering uncertainty left a heavy impression, a reminder that even when corruption is exposed, some secrets may endure in the hidden corners of power. In the aftermath of the trial, Vinyl Vibes underwent a significant transformation. Under the persistent scrutiny of an engaged public and independent auditors, the record store's digital inventory systems were completely overhauled. New procedures were implemented that required real-time logging of every transaction and donation, supported by robust encryption and periodic public audits. Although these changes could not reverse the tragic loss of Calvin Monroe, they stood as a firm commitment to transparency, a promise that no hidden discrepancy would ever again compromise the integrity of the store's legacy. Local media outlets, driven by a passion for investigative journalism, produced a series of in-depth documentaries and articles that meticulously chronicled every aspect of the case, from the quiet discovery in the back office to the painstaking digital reconstructions that uncovered a covert network of corruption. Public forums and community meetings emerged in neighborhood centers, where residents, scholars, and music aficionados debated the ethical responsibilities of digital record-keeping and the necessity of preserving public trust in cultural institutions. The story of Calvin Monroe, a dedicated manager whose pursuit of truth cost him his life, evolved into a symbol of accountability that spurred renewed vigilance among community members. For Detective Patel, every new case was approached with the lessons of this investigation deeply etched in her memory. In the quiet hours of the night, in her modest workspace illuminated by a single desk lamp and the soft hum of her computer, she often reread the recovered pages of Calvin's journal and scrutinized the reconstructed text messages with unwavering focus. Each detail, a slightly altered number in a ledger, a curt warning from a deleted message, served as a constant reminder that persistent inquiry is the key to unveiling corruption, and that every hidden inconsistency, no matter how minor, can unravel a vast network of deceit. As the record store slowly reopened its doors each morning to a new wave of patrons, collectors browsing dusty crates of rare vinyl, students discussing the magic of old records, and casual shoppers drawn by the nostalgic charm, the legacy of the investigation reshaped not only the internal operations of Vinyl Vibes, but also the broader community's commitment to accountability. The reformed digital systems, once vulnerable to subtle manipulation, now stood as exemplars of transparency, routinely audited by independent experts and accessible to any concerned citizen. Ongoing conversations about ethical data management and the preservation of cultural heritage became a staple at local universities and community centers, ensuring that the lessons learned from Calvin Monroe's tragic fate would echo for years to come. Over time, the case at Vinyl Vibes became more than a recounting of a single murder or a series of minute discrepancies. It was a multifaceted exploration of modern corruption, a narrative pieced together from digital clues, detailed financial analyses, and the steadfast determination of a detective who refused to let even the smallest anomaly pass unnoticed. The sweeping reforms that followed, the heightened vigilance among employees, and the community's unwavering commitment to exposing every hidden secret served as a lasting legacy, a reminder that every overlooked detail holds the power to reveal a far-reaching network of deceit. And as the store's vintage turntables spun familiar grooves for a new generation of record lovers, the memory of Calvin Monroe endured, a quiet yet persistent call to challenge every irregularity and to uphold the pursuit of truth as the very foundation of a just society. Inside the grand corridors of the old courthouse, the polished marble floors echoed with the steady footsteps of busy clerks and the quiet murmur of ongoing trials. The historic building, a repository of civic justice for over a century, housed dark wood panels, stained glass windows depicting allegorical scenes of law and order, and heavy brass doors that guarded countless secrets of past proceedings. Today, however, a mystery was unfolding within its solemn walls, one that would shake the community and expose a hidden underbelly of corruption beneath the veneer of tradition. In one of the lesser-used offices, tucked away behind a row of case files in the main administrative wing, a maintenance technician named Gerald Bennett, was finishing his nightly rounds. Gerald, who had worked at the courthouse for more than 20 years, was known for his unwavering attention to detail and his quiet pride in preserving the building's storied history. As he methodically checked the corridors for any anomalies, a loose tile here, a flickering light there, he paused in front of a heavy wooden door, labeled Records. Gerald's practiced eye caught something amiss. On the floor near the door's base lay a shape that did not belong among the orderly stacks of archival boxes and pristine carpets. Moving closer, he shone his flashlight on the scene and discovered a man's body, slumped in an unnatural heap. The victim, dressed in a neatly pressed suit that was now disheveled and stained with dark blotches, lay motionless against the cool tile. His face, once composed and determined, was fixed in an expression of profound shock. In his right hand, with an almost desperate grip, he clutched a small scrap of paper whose edges were tattered and ink-blurred beyond immediate recognition. Gerald's heart pounded as he carefully backed away and fumbled for his radio, his voice shaking as he reported, There's a body in the records room." In a matter of minutes, uniformed officers and forensic specialists arrived, their steps measured and voices low as they began to cordon off the area. Inside the confined records room, the atmosphere was thick with the muted sounds of cameras clicking in measured discussions. Forensic experts, clad in dark navy coveralls, moved deliberately among the stacks of ancient files and filing cabinets, carefully documenting every detail. They photographed the victim's position on the polished floor, the subtle imprint of his shoes in a fine layer of dust, and every minute detail of the scrap of paper that lay crumpled in his grasp. Their methodical approach suggested that nothing about the scene was random, that every element had been arranged with precise intent, as if by someone who wanted to leave behind a hidden message. Investigators later identified the victim as Douglas Hayes, a mid-level administrator responsible for managing the courthouse's archival records and legal files. Douglas was known among his colleagues for his quiet diligence and unwavering commitment to accuracy. His meticulous work had earned him a reputation for reliability, and he was respected by both lawyers and clerks for his scrupulous attention to detail. Now his lifeless body, found in the very heart of the courthouse's record room, raised disturbing questions. Who would target a man so devoted to upholding the integrity of the legal system? And what secret had he uncovered that might have cost him his life? Detective Lila Grant was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator known for her unconventional methods and her ability to find meaning in the minutiae. Without fanfare, she entered the courthouse in the midst of routine business, moving through corridors lined with portraits of long-departed judges and faded historical documents. Rather than immediately racing to secure a timeline, she allowed the surroundings to inform her, the echo of quiet footsteps in polished hallways, the silent testimony of time-worn wood and stone, and the persistent hum of overhead lighting that bathed the scene in sterile brightness. In the records room, Lila knelt beside Douglas's body and gently removed the scrap of paper from his stiff fingers. The paper, water-damaged and frayed at the edges, bore a cryptic jumble of alphanumeric characters. Lila's practiced eyes scanned the hastily written code, and she carefully transcribed every mark into her notebook, convinced that this final clue might be the key to a much larger puzzle. Rather than forcing a single narrative, Detective Grant's investigation began as a mosaic of scattered fragments. Her first step was to gather statements from those who had been present in the courthouse that day. At the information desk in the main lobby, she encountered Marlene Ortiz, a clerk whose gentle manner and warm smile belied a keen sense of observation. Marlene recalled that earlier in the morning, as she processed legal documents and answered phones, she had noticed Douglas in the corridor near the archives. "He seemed agitated, more than usual," Marlene said softly. "I heard him talking on the phone in a hushed, urgent tone, something about numbers that didn't add up in the donation records. I assumed he was dealing with one of those administrative hiccups, but now I worry he might have uncovered something dangerous." Marlene's words, spoken with quiet regret, hinted that Douglas had been investigating discrepancies that were not merely clerical errors but signs of something far more sinister. Next, Lila met with Joseph Joe Ramirez, a longtime custodian who had been on duty in the courthouse. Joe remembered that a few days prior he had seen Douglas lingering by a filing cabinet in a seldom-used corridor, his expression troubled and his eyes darting as if expecting an unseen threat. He was fidgety, almost like he was searching for something in the papers. Joe recalled, his voice low and steady. He mentioned something about missing entries in the records, small amounts, barely noticeable at first, but persistent. I didn't think much of it then, but in retrospect, it looks like he was onto a major discrepancy. Joe's recollections added a layer of urgency to the investigation, suggesting that Douglas's careful scrutiny of the records had brought him into conflict with powerful interests. Determined to uncover the truth behind Douglas's discoveries, Detective Grant obtained a warrant to search his modest apartment, a sparsely furnished unit in an old building just off the courthouse grounds. The apartment was unremarkable, its single room dominated by a small couch, a cluttered desk, and a narrow window overlooking a busy street. The air was tinged with the scent of stale coffee and old paper, a quiet archive of a life defined by routine and meticulous record-keeping. In a locked drawer of a battered oak desk, Lila discovered Douglas's personal journal, a time-worn leather-bound notebook whose pages were filled with detailed entries documenting his work, his observations, and his growing concerns. The early pages were entirely mundane, listing daily shifts, routine checks, and simple notations on file management. But as the entries progressed, a sense of unease permeated the text. In one particularly chilling entry, dated 3 days before his death, Douglas wrote, "I have discovered persistent discrepancies in our donation and supply records, small amounts missing from every transaction that, when totaled, are far too significant to be an error. I fear that someone with privileged access is systematically diverting funds for their own benefit. If I continue to investigate, I may expose a secret that those in power would do anything to keep hidden." The final line ended abruptly, as if his pen had been seized mid-thought, leaving behind an eerie silence on the page that resonated with impending doom. Simultaneously, the cyber unit managed to recover fragments of deleted text messages from Douglas's aging cell phone, a device that bore the scars of years of constant use and whose cracked screen had witnessed many late nights. The recovered messages were brief and unadorned. One simply read, "Stop now," while another warned, "Don't ask questions." Their stark, impersonal tone left no room for ambiguity. These were clear directives, issued by an unknown source, and they confirmed that someone had been intent on silencing Douglas before he could expose the truth. Rather than imposing a rigid chronological narrative on the case, Detective Grant allowed the investigation to branch out like the intricate lines of an old blueprint. With permission from the courthouse administration, she turned her attention to the vast archive of administrative records housed in a cramped back office deep within the building. The room was a time capsule of decades past, a cluttered collection of handwritten ledgers, aging computers displaying faded digital logs, and stacks of paper that chronicled the ebb and flow of countless transactions. Working side by side with Harold Jenkins, a veteran records clerk whose career spanned over 40 years, Lila meticulously compared the digital entries with the original paper documents. The differences were minute, a single digit off here, a date changed there, but when these small discrepancies were compiled over the course of several months, they revealed a pattern too consistent to be dismissed as innocent error. The digital records uniformly showed that every shipment and donation was recorded as complete, while the handwritten logs consistently documented slight shortfalls, tiny amounts missing from each entry that when summed amounted to a significant diversion of funds. Forensic accountants were then brought in to scrutinize the financial data. Their exhaustive analysis produced detailed charts and graphs that mapped the cumulative effect of the discrepancies. The numbers were damning. These minor shortfalls, insignificant on any given day, had over time resulted in the misappropriation of a substantial sum, a sum that had been siphoned off through a labyrinth of electronic transfers to an offshore account linked to a shell corporation. Every fractional difference, every slight alteration in the records, contributed to a broader narrative of deliberate, systematic fraud, a network of mid-level administrators who had exploited vulnerabilities in both digital and paper-based systems for their own enrichment. As layers of evidence continued to build, Detective Grant began receiving anonymous tips. A plain envelope discovered behind a filing cabinet contained a typed note that stated simply, "Every figure hides a secret." Another tip, delivered via a secure email from an untraceable account, urged her to cease your investigation. Although these messages provided little in the way of specifics, their tone was unmistakably menacing, a clear indication that those responsible were watching her every move and were prepared to take drastic measures to keep their illicit operation hidden. Federal agents, alerted to the potential magnitude of the corruption, soon joined the investigation with their state-of-the-art digital forensic tools. They painstakingly reconstructed a near-complete timeline of the deleted text messages from Douglas's phone, revealing that the warnings had escalated sharply in the final days before his murder. Concurrently, forensic accountants developed intricate models that detailed how the incremental misappropriation of funds, when aggregated over time, resulted in a significant diversion from the courthouse's operating budget. The combined evidence formed an inescapable mosaic, a meticulously orchestrated cover-up that had drained resources for years, and when Douglas's investigation threatened to expose the truth, his life was callously taken. Detective Grant compiled all her findings into a comprehensive report, a sprawling dossier of over 400 pages interwoven with photographs of the crime scene in the silent corridors of the records room, scans of pages from Douglas's journal, digital reconstructions of the deleted text messages, and detailed financial analyses that traced the diverted funds to their offshore destination. The report presented a coherent narrative. For years, subtle discrepancies in the courthouse's donation and supply records had been deliberately engineered to divert funds into an offshore account. When Douglas began to document these irregularities, his inquiry threatened to reveal a deep-seated network of corruption, a network that, in a ruthless bid to protect its secret, ended his life. The district attorney, disturbed by the implications of the evidence for the integrity of the judicial system, convened a grand jury in a modern courthouse renowned for its uncompromising commitment to justice. Over a series of marathon sessions that extended deep into stormy nights, expert witnesses testified about the digital forensic techniques used to recover the deleted text messages, the statistical analyses that proved the discrepancies were far too systematic to be accidental, and the forensic accounting that traced the misappropriated funds to an offshore account tied to a shell corporation. Their testimonies, delivered with unwavering technical precision, left little room for doubt. After lengthy deliberation, the grand jury returned indictments on multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to homicide, charges that directly linked the manipulation of records to the murder of Dr. Edwin Carver. The trial unfolded over several weeks in a packed courtroom, filled with courthouse employees, local residents, legal scholars, and journalists. Federal prosecutors presented their case with relentless clarity, interweaving digital reconstructions of the recovered text messages with detailed financial charts that illustrated how minor discrepancies, when aggregated, diverted a substantial sum of money from the courthouse's operating budget. A digital forensics expert took the stand, painstakingly explaining how each curt command, "Stop now, don't ask questions," had been reassembled into a continuous timeline that grew increasingly urgent as the investigation advanced. Forensic accountants unveiled intricate graphs that demonstrated how the accumulation of minor errors resulted in a financial gap that could only be the product of deliberate, systematic fraud. Witness after witness testified about the gradual erosion of record integrity, a slow, almost imperceptible process that allowed corruption to infiltrate a system once held sacred by the community. When Detective Grant finally took the stand, her voice was steady but laced with personal sorrow. She recounted in careful detail the moment she discovered Douglas's body in the quiet corridor of the records room, the cold, unforgiving floor beneath her, the faint imprint of his shoes in a shallow pool of moisture, and the fragile scrap of paper that clutched in his hand, offering a final cryptic clue. Her narrative wove together every piece of evidence, from the altered digital logs and handwritten discrepancies to the recovered journal entries and stark text messages, forming an unassailable portrait of deliberate, systematic corruption. Every word was delivered with thoughtful precision, leaving the courtroom in a reflective hush as the enormity of the betrayal was laid bare. In the end, the grand jury's indictments led to the conviction of several mid-level administrators and technical operatives implicated in the fraudulent scheme. They received lengthy prison sentences, their names etched in public records as stark warnings against the exploitation of institutional trust. Yet many in the community believed that full justice remained out of reach. The highest-ranking conspirators, the architects behind the diversion, managed to elude exposure through intricate legal defenses, and their identities remained largely obscured in the final verdicts. That lingering uncertainty cast a heavy shadow, a reminder that even when corruption is brought to light, some secrets endure in the hidden recesses of power. In the aftermath of the trial, the courthouse's administration was forced to confront a new era of accountability, under relentless public scrutiny, and with independent auditors meticulously examining every transaction. The institution overhauled its digital record-keeping systems. New procedures were implemented that required real-time logging of every donation, every supply order, and every administrative decision, all fortified with robust encryption and subjected to regular public audits. Although these reforms could never undo the tragic loss of Dr. Carver, they signified a steadfast commitment to transparency, a promise that no hidden discrepancy would again undermine the public's trust. Local media outlets, driven by a commitment to investigative reporting, produced a series of documentaries and in-depth articles that painstakingly chronicled every facet of the case, from the grim discovery in the quiet corridors of the records room to the digital reconstructions that unmasked a covert network of corruption. Public forums and town hall meetings emerged in community centers, where residents, scholars, and civic leaders engaged in vigorous discussions about the ethical responsibilities of data management and the necessity of safeguarding public trust. The story of Dr. Edwin Carver, a dedicated administrator whose pursuit of truth cost him his life, became a potent symbol of accountability, igniting a renewed vigilance among community members to scrutinize every record and expose every hidden inconsistency. For Detective Grant, every new investigation was approached with the hard-earned lessons of this case etched deeply into her memory. In the quiet hours before the courthouse reopened each morning, in her modest office lit by a single desk lamp and the low hum of her computer, she often revisited the recovered pages of Dr. Carver's journal and examined the reconstructed text messages with painstaking care. Each tiny detail, a slight alteration in a ledger entry, a curt directive in a deleted message, reinforced her belief that persistent inquiry is the only pathway to justice, and that every seemingly insignificant inconsistency holds the potential to unravel vast networks of corruption. As the courthouse gradually resumed its busy routine, lawyers filing briefs in polished halls, clerks diligently organizing records, and the steady hum of judicial proceedings filling every corridor, the legacy of the investigation reshaped not only the institution's internal operations, but also the community's broader commitment to accountability. The reformed digital systems, once vulnerable to manipulation, now stood as beacons of transparency, rigorously audited by independent experts and accessible to any concerned citizen. Public conversations regarding the ethical management of data and the preservation of historical integrity became frequent topics in local seminars and civic gatherings, ensuring that the lessons learned from Dr. Carver's tragic fate would endure. Ultimately, the case at the old courthouse was not just a recounting of a single murder or a series of minor discrepancies. It was a deep dive into the hidden currents of modern corruption, a narrative pieced together from digital clues, rigorous financial analyses, and the unwavering determination of an investigator who refused to let even the smallest details slip away. The reforms that followed, the increased vigilance among staff, and the community's shared commitment to question every anomaly became a lasting reminder that every hidden secret, no matter how insignificant it may seem, has the power to expose a network of deceit. As the courthouse doors swung open each day to a new chapter of civic life and justice, the memory of Dr. Edwin Carver remained, a subtle yet persistent call to examine every detail, challenge every inconsistency, and uphold the truth as the foundation of a fair society. Inside the pulsating heart of the city aquarium, where visitors marveled at the graceful ballet of neon-lit fish and the silent power of great white sharks, the atmosphere was one of wonder and quiet awe. In the public galleries, families and tourists moved from one exhibit to the next, their voices blending with the soft ambient music that filled the space. But far from the throng of admirers, in a small secured office tucked behind a row of colossal saltwater tanks, an entirely different drama was unfolding, one that would expose a web of deception hidden deep within the institution's core. Jamal Ortiz, the night shift administrator responsible for overseeing both the daily operations and the sensitive financial records of the aquarium, was known for his unwavering diligence. Each evening, long after the crowds had dispersed, he methodically checked the logbooks and digital files that recorded everything from donation receipts to supply orders. His office, lined with dusty books and humming old computers, served as a sanctuary for data and detail, a place where every transaction was scrutinized and every anomaly noted. On what appeared to be an ordinary evening, while cross-checking inventory reports and reconciling recent donations from corporate sponsors, Jamal noticed a series of small discrepancies that gnawed at his meticulous nature. A few dollars were missing here. A shipment of specialized filtration equipment was recorded as complete in the digital logs, but not in the handwritten ledgers, and the totals for a recent round of charity contributions seemed just off enough to raise a red flag. Troubled by these inconsistencies, he began jotting down his observations in a worn leather notebook, each entry more frantic than the last. Unbeknownst to him, his quiet investigation had begun to awaken dangerous interests within the aquarium's administrative hierarchy. Over the course of several days, Jamal had grown increasingly absorbed in his work. He reviewed invoices late into the night, cross-referenced electronic records with paper files, and made countless phone calls to suppliers. Each anomaly, no matter how trivial it might seem in isolation, accumulated into a picture that suggested deliberate tampering. The numbers were nearly perfect on the digital side, but always seemed to fall short on the paper logs, a subtle but deliberate manipulation. Jamal's concern deepened when he discovered that several donations earmarked for upgrading the aquarium's aging filtration system did not match the amounts reported in the financial software. The gap was small at first, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, but as he compared month-to-month data, a pattern emerged that chilled him to the bone. One rainy evening, after the aquarium had closed to the public and the echo of the day's excitement had faded into silence, Jamal returned to his office for one final review. In the dim light of his desk lamp, his eyes scanned over the latest set of records when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A critical ledger that had been meticulously maintained for years now contained a series of unexplained omissions. With a shaky hand, he reached for his notebook and wrote, "Discrepancies in donation records, amounts missing, accounts not balancing. I fear I am onto something." His heart pounded as he realized that these numbers might not be an innocent error after all, but a deliberate diversion of funds intended for essential upgrades. That night, as Jamal prepared to leave the office, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. He made a mental note to return first thing in the morning, to gather further evidence. But as he locked up and stepped out into the silent corridors of the aquarium, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure that moved with silent purpose toward the records room. A brief exchange of hurried words was overheard by a security guard patrolling nearby, but the conversation was muffled, obscured by the ambient hum of distant machinery. Moments later, a piercing scream shattered the fragile quiet of the building. Rushing toward the sound, Jamal reached the records room, only to find it empty. In its place lay a scene of disarray, a toppled filing cabinet, scattered papers, and most chilling of all, the lifeless body of his colleague and friend, Terrence Grant, slumped against the wall in a pool of cold, drying blood. Terrence, a mid-level financial analyst whose analytical skills had been second to none, was known for his ability to spot inconsistencies in even the most complex spreadsheets. His friendly demeanor and quiet determination had made him a trusted figure in the department. Now, his body lay amid the chaos of the records room, a stark testament to the danger of uncovering secrets. In his right hand, Terrence clutched a small scrap of paper, its once clear message now reduced to an indecipherable smear of numbers and letters. The scene was chillingly deliberate. Everything had been arranged with precision, as if to send a final message that no one yet understood. Detective Layla Ramirez was called to the scene. With years of experience navigating complex cases, Layla was known for her ability to reconstruct events from the faintest traces. She arrived at the aquarium in silence, her eyes immediately drawn to the meticulous detail of the records room. Instead of rushing to collect evidence, she took a moment to let the environment speak to her. The echo of distant water dripping from ancient pipes, the soft rustle of paper in a cold draft, the oppressive stillness that had settled over the room like a shroud. Kneeling beside Terrence's body, Layla carefully pried the scrap of paper from his grasp and examined it under the beam of her flashlight. The message was cryptic, a chaotic series of digits and letters that seemed to hint at a code or perhaps a hastily composed warning. Every detail, the tear along one edge, the faint smudges of blood that marred the paper, the way it had clung to Terence's stiff fingers was meticulously recorded in her notebook. Rather than impose a tidy chronology on the unfolding mystery, Detective Ramirez allowed her investigation to branch out organically. Her first step was to gather statements from those who had been at the aquarium in the days leading up to the tragedy. In the crowded lobby of the facility, where the remnants of the day's visitors still lingered, she met with Marlene Ortiz, a veteran ticket clerk whose eyes were wide with worry. Marlene recalled that Terence had been unusually preoccupied in the week before the incident. He'd be at his desk, poring over numbers and whispering on the phone, almost as if he was chasing down a mistake. Marlene said softly, "I overheard him mention something about missing funds in the donation records and discrepancies in the supply logs. I thought it was just stress, but now I believe he was onto something that might have put him in danger." Marlene's account, though brief, added an important layer to the mystery, a suggestion that Terence's relentless scrutiny of the records had threatened to expose something deeply sinister. Next, Layla spoke with Darren Collins, a security guard who had patrolled the quiet back corridors. Darren recalled that on the night of the incident, he had seen Terence near the records room, his expression tense and hurried. He was talking on his phone and looked like he was arguing with someone. Darren recalled, his voice low. He mentioned something about the numbers not matching up, that he was going to get to the bottom of it. I didn't think much of it then, but in retrospect, it seems he was on the verge of uncovering a major discrepancy. Darren's testimony further confirmed that Terence had been delving into something dangerous, a line of inquiry that had ultimately made him a target. Haunted by these accounts, Detective Ramirez obtained a warrant to search Terence's modest apartment, a small unit in an aging building not far from the aquarium. The apartment was stark, a single room with minimal furnishings, a simple bed pushed against a faded wall, a cluttered desk, and a narrow window overlooking a busy street. The scent of stale coffee and old newspapers hung in the air, echoing the quiet persistence of a life devoted to precision. In a locked drawer of an ancient desk, Layla discovered Terence's personal journal, a battered leather-bound notebook filled with neat, deliberate entries. The early pages were mundane. Notes on daily work routines, records of shipments received, and short observations about the state of the financial logs. However, as the entries continued, a growing unease became apparent. In one entry, dated 3 days before his death, Terence wrote, "There are small persistent discrepancies in our donation records, tiny amounts missing from every transaction that, when summed, create a significant gap. I fear that someone with access is intentionally manipulating the data for personal gain. I must be cautious. If I continue, I risk exposing a secret that those in power would kill to protect." The final sentence ended abruptly, the ink fading as if his pen had been snatched mid-thought, leaving behind a silent, haunting void. At the same time, the cyber unit managed to recover fragments of deleted text messages from Terence's battered cell phone, a device with a cracked screen and keys smoothed by years of relentless use. The recovered messages were brief and chilling. One read simply, "Stop now," while another stated, "Don't ask questions." Their stark, unadorned tone was unmistakable, a clear directive from an unknown source that had been issued too late to prevent tragedy. Instead of constructing a linear narrative immediately, Detective Ramirez allowed the investigation to branch out like a network of interconnected clues. With permission from the aquarium's board of directors, she turned her attention to the administrative records stored in a cramped back office deep within the facility. The room was a repository of decades of data, a chaotic blend of old paper ledgers, aging computers, and stacks of meticulously preserved transaction records. Working alongside Harold Jenkins, a seasoned records clerk, whose long career had given him an almost intuitive understanding of every document, Layla meticulously compared the digital logs with the original handwritten records. The differences were subtle, a single digit altered here, a date shifted there, but when these minor discrepancies were aggregated over several months, they revealed a pattern too consistent to be dismissed as accidental. The digital logs always indicated that every shipment and donation was complete, while the handwritten records repeatedly recorded slight shortfalls, tiny amounts missing from each entry that, when summed, amounted to a significant diversion of funds. Forensic accountants were brought in, and their exhaustive analysis produced detailed charts and graphs that mapped the cumulative impact of these discrepancies. The numbers were damning. These small shortfalls, insignificant on any individual day, had over time resulted in the misappropriation of a substantial sum, a sum that had been covertly transferred through a labyrinth of electronic transactions to an offshore account linked to a shell corporation. Every fractional variance, every minor alteration, contributed to a broader narrative of deliberate systematic fraud, a network of mid-level administrators who had exploited vulnerabilities in both digital and paper-based record-keeping systems for their own enrichment. As layers of evidence continued to accumulate, Detective Ramirez began receiving anonymous tips. A plain envelope, discovered tucked away behind a stack of files in the back office, contained a typed note that read, "Every number conceals a secret." Another tip, sent via a secure email from an untraceable address, bluntly warned her, "Cease your investigation." Although these messages offered few specifics, their tone was unambiguously menacing, a clear indication that those responsible were monitoring her progress and were prepared to take drastic measures if their cover was threatened. Federal agents, alerted by the potential magnitude of the corruption, joined the investigation with their state-of-the-art digital forensic tools. They painstakingly reconstructed a nearly complete timeline of the deleted text messages from Terrence's phone, revealing that the warnings had escalated in frequency during the final days before his murder. Concurrently, forensic accountants developed intricate models that demonstrated how the aggregation of minor discrepancies over time resulted in a significant diversion of funds. The combined evidence formed an inescapable mosaic, a meticulously orchestrated cover-up that had siphoned off resources for years, and when Terrence's investigation threatened to reveal the truth, his life was extinguished in a cold, calculated act. Detective Ramirez compiled all her findings into a comprehensive report, a sprawling dossier of over 400 pages, interwoven with photographs of the crime scene in the silent corridors of the records office, scans of pages from Terrence's journal, digital reconstructions of the deleted text messages, and detailed financial analyses that traced the misappropriated funds to their offshore destination. The dossier presented a clear narrative. For years, subtle discrepancies in the aquarium's donation and supply records had been deliberately engineered to divert funds into an offshore account. When Terrence began to document these irregularities, his investigation threatened to expose a deeply entrenched network of corruption, a network that, in a ruthless bid to preserve its secret, ended his life. The district attorney, disturbed by the implications for the integrity of the institution and public trust, convened a grand jury in a sleek, modern courthouse known for its steadfast pursuit of accountability. Over a series of lengthy sessions that stretched into stormy nights, expert witnesses testified about the digital forensic methods used to recover the deleted messages, the statistical analyses confirming that the discrepancies were far too systematic to be mere errors, and the forensic accounting that traced the diverted funds to an offshore account associated with a shell corporation. Their testimonies, delivered with meticulous technical precision, left little room for doubt. After exhaustive deliberation, the grand jury returned indictments on multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to homicide, charges that directly linked the systematic manipulation of records to the murder of Dr. Edwin Carver. The trial spanned several weeks in a packed courtroom filled with aquarium staff, local residents, legal scholars, and a swarm of journalists. Federal prosecutors presented their case with unwavering clarity, interweaving digital reconstructions of the recovered text messages with detailed financial charts that illustrated how minor discrepancies, when aggregated, diverted a substantial sum from the institution's budget. A digital forensics expert took the stand and painstakingly explained how each curt command, "Stop now, don't ask questions," had been reassembled into a continuous timeline that escalated as the investigation advanced. Forensic accountants unveiled intricate graphs demonstrating how the accumulation of small errors produced a financial gap that could only be the product of deliberate, systematic fraud. Numerous witnesses testified about the gradual erosion of record integrity, a slow, imperceptible process that allowed corruption to take root in a system once revered for its transparency. When Detective Ramirez finally testified, her voice was measured yet resonated with deep personal sorrow. She recounted, in painstaking detail, the moment she discovered Terrence's body in the deserted corridor of the records office, the cold, unforgiving tile beneath her feet, the faint imprint of his shoes in a thin layer of condensation, and the fragile scrap of paper that now served as a haunting final clue. Her narrative wove together every piece of evidence, from the altered digital logs and handwritten discrepancies to the recovered journal pages and stark text messages, forming an unassailable portrait of deliberate systematic corruption. Every observation, delivered with careful deliberation, left the courtroom in a heavy silence as the full magnitude of the betrayal was laid bare. In the end, the grand jury's indictments led to the conviction of several mid-level administrators and technical operatives directly implicated in the fraudulent scheme. They received lengthy prison sentences, and their names were etched in public records as stern warnings against the abuse of institutional trust. Yet a sense of incomplete justice lingered among the community. The highest-ranking conspirators, the architects behind the diversion, managed to shield themselves through complex legal maneuvers, and their identities remained largely concealed in the final verdicts. This unresolved uncertainty cast a lingering shadow over the case, a reminder that even when significant corruption is exposed, some secrets endure in the hidden corners of power. In the months following the trial, the aquarium's leadership was forced to confront a new era of accountability. Under intense public scrutiny, and with independent auditors meticulously examining every transaction, the institution overhauled its digital record-keeping systems. New protocols required real-time logging of every donation, every supply order, and every administrative decision, bolstered by robust encryption measures and regular public audits. Although these reforms could never restore the life lost, they stood as a firm commitment to transparency, a promise that no hidden discrepancy would again erode the public's trust. Local media outlets, fueled by a steadfast dedication to investigative journalism, produced a series of documentaries and detailed articles that chronicled every aspect of the case, from the quiet discovery in the records room to the painstaking digital reconstructions that unmasked a covert network of corruption. Public forums and community meetings emerged in civic centers, where residents, scholars, and cultural advocates engaged in earnest discussions about the ethical responsibilities of digital record keeping and the importance of preserving institutional integrity. The story of Dr. Edwin Carver, a dedicated administrator whose pursuit of truth cost him his life, became a powerful symbol of accountability, inspiring a renewed vigilance among community members to scrutinize every record and expose every hidden anomaly. For Detective Ramirez, every new investigation was approached with the hard-earned lessons of this case deeply etched in her memory. In the quiet hours before the courthouse reopened each morning, in her modest office illuminated by a solitary desk lamp and the soft hum of her computer, she often revisited the recovered pages of the journal and studied the reconstructed text messages with unwavering focus. Each tiny detail, a marginal change in a ledger entry, a curt command in a deleted message, reminded her that persistent inquiry is essential and that even the smallest inconsistency has the power to unravel vast networks of deceit. As the aquarium resumed its daily rhythm, visitors exploring the vibrant exhibits, staff diligently maintaining every tank and display, and the soft murmur of conversation blending with the bubbling of water, the legacy of the investigation transformed not only the internal operations of the institution, but also the broader community's commitment to accountability. The reformed digital systems, once vulnerable to subtle manipulation, now stood as pillars of transparency, rigorously audited by independent experts and accessible to any concerned citizen. Ongoing discussions about ethical data management and the preservation of public trust became a mainstay at local universities and civic gatherings, ensuring that the lessons learned from Dr. Carver's tragic fate would continue to inspire vigilance. Ultimately, the case at the City Aquarium was more than a recounting of a single murder or a series of seemingly trivial discrepancies. It was a deep exploration into modern corruption, a narrative assembled from digital fragments, detailed financial analysis, and the unwavering determination of a detective who refused to let even the smallest detail escape notice. The sweeping reforms that followed, the increased alertness among staff, and the community's shared resolve to scrutinize every record became a lasting legacy, each hidden secret a reminder that the quest for truth is unending. And as the glass doors of the aquarium opened each day to welcome a new wave of curious minds, the memory of Dr. Edwin Carver lived on, a quiet call to examine every detail, challenge every anomaly, and ensure that the pursuit of justice remains the foundation of a society committed to accountability.